Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey. This is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what's up, bro?
Not too much, brother. Today, we're going to be chatting about how not a single body has been found at any former residential school sites in Canada, the UN reducing the estimate of women and children casualties in Gaza by half, the wild demands from trans activists for their Rainbow Week of Action, CSIS warning that China is exploiting renewable energy to gain leverage over Canada, the Bank of Canada warning that mortgage payment renewals will skyrocket over 60% by 2026, and the Rage Index reaching all-time highs as Canadians are angry with the government, economy, and policies. However, if before we get into things you wouldn't mind giving us a kind review on Spotify or subscribing to our YouTube channel wherever you are watching, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, let's get started. First off, we've got not a single body being found at any former residential school sites in Canada. The Crown Indigenous Relations Department spent $7.9 million taxpayer dollars aimed at locating the bodies of Indigenous children reportedly buried at a former residential school in Kamloops, BC. Despite the significant funding, not a single body has been discovered at any former residential school sites in Canada, leading to growing scrutiny and frustration. The initial media coverage in Canada about mass graves at residential schools emerged in May 2021 when archaeologists identified what they believed to be 215 unmarked graves at an old school in Kamloops, utilizing radar technology to detect anomalies. Similar radar technology was employed at a former residential school in Manitoba, where 14 quote-unquote anomalies were detected. However, subsequent excavation efforts revealed that these anomalies were simply geological formations like rocks and dirt. The CBC played a pivotal role in perpetuating the mass graves narrative, contributing to widespread protests and incidents of arson targeting churches across the country. Since 2021, at least 83 churches have been either destroyed by fire or subjected to vandalism, reflecting the heightened tensions and emotions surrounding this issue. So, will this narrative, which stained Canada's reputation on the international stage, be corrected, or has the damage already been done?
It's interesting. Actually, another church in Canada's oldest city went up like yesterday.
Oh, wow.
Yep. So make it 84. I think that, like every government narrative, they're going to do whatever they can to stick to the script. I don't think they're going to go off from their particular story they're telling here, regardless of the evidence that comes forward. So I did a little bit of research when I read this and when I wrote this article. And the reason is because originally I thought, okay, well, maybe nothing happened or nobody died. So I wanted to educate myself a little bit so I didn't sound like a complete dick. So according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, over 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were placed in government-funded church-run residential school systems, mainly overseen by the Catholic Church. And this started in the 1830s. After investigating for 6 years, the commission heard from numerous survivors who suffered abuse in various forms. According to the reports, around 6,000 Indigenous children are estimated to have died in these schools, although experts suggest the actual number may be higher. I'm not sure who these experts are. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has documented over 4,000 names of those who died in these institutions. So based on these reports, I'm not implying that terrible events didn't occur at these schools. However, up to now, the allegations of buried children or buried children, unmarked graves, or missing children appears to be all smoke and no fire. Now, some might say, well, who cares? Atrocities happened anyway, so that's what matters most. But I'll tell you why I think that's important. Our government has been flirting with the idea of making residential school denialism a crime. So this is a compelled speech situation again. So Canada's Justice Minister is considering options raised by the Independent Advisor on Unmarked Graves, who says that Indigenous leaders want Canada to move forward by criminalizing residential school denialism. So Kimberly Murray, the Independent Advisor on Unmarked Graves, which is super surprising that that's still a job to me, that we pay someone for this, called on our politicians to consider legal mechanisms that could address the practice of denying or minimizing the abuses of Indigenous children suffered at residential schools. So Murray said that one way to do this is by amending the criminal code to criminalize such actions, noting that the Liberals did so in 2022 on the issue of Holocaust denialism. And I quote, "We could do the same for Indigenous people," she said, "making it an offense to incite hate and promote hate against Indigenous people by denying that residential schools happened or downplaying what happened in the institutions. Yet here we are with no proof." And that's my big problem here. First of all, I really don't think the government should have made it illegal to deny the Holocaust. I think it's ridiculous if you do deny it. but I don't think they should do, because it's a compelled speech issue. So for me, this is how you open the door to all these much bigger, more egregious free speech problems. With respect to how we look on the international stage on this, I mean, it's kind of interesting, right? Because they went full force when this happened. They went right to the Pope. They're like, this is your fault. You have to take responsibility. He's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Not a chance. They're very, very pot committed here. So don't be surprised if you see this story snuffed out as much as possible to try to keep it quiet, because you just look bad, right?
I think the damage has already been done, very much so, on this. It's funny, like even a year ago, I mentioned to somebody about how I don't think it's smart to go along with this narrative when there hasn't actually been any evidence of this, because they were used as a way to say that this was Canada's genocide against Indigenous people. And to me, I'm like, hey, if we're going to say something is a genocide, we should at least have a single body to point to. Like, that's a very large accusation to levy against somebody. But to your point about those deaths, the vast majority of those deaths were due to disease, influenza, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. And because it was, and you can chalk that up to mismanagement of these schools.
Absolutely.
So, for instance, they weren't very sanitary. The children were crammed into overpopulated living areas. So there was definitely some culpability on these schools, but that's a very different narrative than essentially we were mass slaughtering these children, right? It's just like, okay, we weren't taking the proper precautions in order to provide and there's also something to be said, hey, with these schools in general. I am of the mind that these schools top to bottom were immoral, in the sense where they were just indoctrination camps. They were used to try to take the Indigenous population and essentially erase their ties to their culture and their knowledge and their language even as well, and to try to forcefully assimilate them into Western culture. So by no means am I trying to say that these residential schools were moral or a aspect of history that we should just pretend it didn't exist. But again, it is very important for us to have realistic pictures of how these things played out, because too, the narrative is that Europeans came over here, landed on a nation that was at peace, and all these Indigenous people, very much like the noble savage idea. There's actually a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau who is very much popularized, and he's very big in these university circles and these elite circles, and he propagated the notion of noble savage, that it's civilization that turns humanity into evil individuals and such. Yeah. So he thought his whole thing was like, he wrote a massive, and it was very influential. It was called The Origins of Inequality, and he came to the conclusion that inequality stems by the creation of private property. That before there was something.
He's a Marxist.
Marxist before Marxist, because he was even before that time. But so his whole idea was that, yeah, private property creates inequality, and before that, everybody was these communal, very noble and loving and peaceful, and everybody cooperated.
I don't
amazingly.
think he understands much about how humans got here today.
No,
that's wild.
And then you go look back at, there's a great book called Empire of the Summer Moon, which I'd highly recommend anyone listening. Now, it was more in regards to America and the wars between the settlers and the Aboriginals in America, in Southern America in specific. But that book does a fantastic job of illuminating how you couldn't look at either one of those parties, whether it be the settlers or the Indigenous, and come out of there going, oh, one of these parties was the good guys. Like, so for instance, one thing that he points to in that book is how miscarriages were extremely high in Aboriginal communities because women were riding horseback a lot while pregnant, and they never made that connection that this was causing a lot of miscarriages. So what Aboriginal people would do in that is, specifically the Comanches as well, but they would go into these settlements and slaughter all the men, kill all of the children that were essentially too old to be reindoctrinated. So they would then take the children from these settlements and the women, turn the women into slave surrogates, essentially.
Right.
They became just like, they got tied up and they were forcefully impregnated, and they were supposed to essentially repopulate these indigenous communities. And you read too about how one tribe was treating the next, like the Comanches in specific were crazy. There was, in this book he talks about it as well, how they would go to neighboring tribes and how they gleefully killed one another, how the Comanches would chop the limbs off of all of the men, take out their tongues, and then throw them on the fire before they could die, and how they would like take great pleasure in watching these people, like their final minutes of just like straight up suffering. And so the reason I'm saying this is because evil does not exist in different groups. It doesn't exist in European settlers. It doesn't exist only in Indigenous. It doesn't only exist in the Soviet Union or China or whatever. All of these things, it's like all of us have the capacity to do these terrible things to one another. And until we have that narrative spread like crazy, that it's that the way forwards is really inwards, then I see these things continuing to happen over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, one thing to be interesting to look at, just to understand the statistics behind it, would be to see how many other children were going to these residential schools that were not Indigenous, and how many died during those same periods because of things like tuberculosis or disease or anything else. Not that that's like, just so I have a more clear picture of what's going on, because if the numbers are pretty well the same, per capita, for everyone else that attended these schools, it's still horrific. Don't get me wrong, but you're kind of going, okay, maybe it's just a sign of the times. Again, I'm not defending the schools. I don't like the idea of school in general, so I'm not really there for it. But I think it would just be interesting to know that information. What I find we do in Canada, I find that we just pay the Indigenous lip service for the most part. They still don't have clean drinking water. Of all the initiatives that Trudeau said he was going to execute for them, I think he did like a single-digit percentage of them. That's it. Like zero, almost nothing. But what he does is he appeals to or appeases the right people within the group. So there's enough people that are doing really well within that community that are continued to be taken care of. And so that seems to be good enough. That's all they need to do to keep them at bay. And then to do things like this. A lot of this is tough when you look at the narrative that's painted for a lot of Indigenous people growing up today. And it's the same with, like, you look at a lot of Black people today that are being told, hey, you're a victim of this kind of oppression. The problem with that, even if there was a time when it was true, you should not continue that narrative moving forward, because it doesn't help the people today. It doesn't help those, like, a lot of those people now are either have this entitlement, or they feel like they're not good enough because of. Both of those things are not really helpful in unity, or really unifying people, and really progress, right? Which seems to be one of those things where, our government continues to tell us that they're so progressive, yet everything they do seems to be going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think this narrative is like, it's the equivalent of the American slavery idea, where it's like, okay, we can hyper push this one narrative to make people ashamed of the nation of Canada, because then you can change it into something else. Again, I've made the analogy before of when you're in a relationship with, say, a narcissistic abuser, the first thing they do is they break you down before they try to mold you into their desired partner, right? And I think this is very much of that same idea. And I mean, this is something even Orwell pointed out, right, when he said, those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. And that is a very true thing. And so I am always very skeptical of anyone who is trying to make historical narratives that paint one party as oppressors. And because whether it be right-wing extremist movements in the past like fascism, or whether it be left-wing extremist movements like Marxism and communism, all of them have to establish that narrative before they create their revolution. And I think that's exactly what we're doing here, is being like, look, you shouldn't be proud to be Canadian because of all the terrible things we've done before. And yes, those things are terrible and we should look at them, but it's very important, again, to realize that all of those things that Canada has been guilty of almost every single culture and peoples in history has also been guilty of doing those things. I mean, hell, China is doing it right now in Africa through their roads and belts, their Belts and Roads Initiative, and they're forcefully indoctrinating the many Africans through it. So it's like, you know, this idea that this is something that is unique to Western civilization or European culture is just not true.
No, it's a human psychology. It's a strategy. That's all it is. No, I totally agree. It's an interesting point, actually, when you consider how they're kind of either trying to reframe or erase the past. And you're seeing a lot with, you know, they're taking down a lot of historical statues and they're trying to erase a lot of these things, change the name of Dundas, all this stuff in it. You know, it's a good point. I mean, it does sort of make you think like, why are they trying to break everything down? And like you said, just sort of rebuild a new narrative.
All right, well, moving on here to the next story, we've got UN reducing Gaza women and children casualty estimate by nearly half. The United Nations has made significant adjustments to its reported casualty figures for the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. Initially, the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reported that over 9,500 women and 14,500 children were among the casualties. However, these numbers have been revised downward by nearly half. The current figures now indicate that under 5,000 women and 8,000 children are officially listed by the UN as casualties of the conflict. So will this change the course of the international protests against Israel and by extension Jews, or will it continue on as we're seeing?
Well, you know, to your point before, once the cat's out of the bag, you can't really put it back. You know, look, these numbers are still horrific, but obviously the inaccuracy does have real world consequences. I mean, I think a lot of these anti-Israel protests have boiled over because of these types of figures, because of this information. Sure, there are actors there are pro-Hamas actors that are involved in this that are sort of instigating a lot of these encampments and stuff. But at the end of the day, like, if these numbers are less than half, you know, I can't say that it would have stopped protests, but I can suggest that they would have been, the scale and intensity of them would have been a lot less. Perhaps. It's hard to say, but you don't know, right? And that's the problem with this kind of stuff is people chalk it up to oopsie, but no, it has real world consequences.
Yeah, and that's the problem when, from the beginning of this conflict, the sole information that has been coming out of it about casualties has been from Hamas. Like, they're not allowing independent organizations to come in and look through their records and stuff, right? And here's what's really sketchy about the whole scenario as well is Hamas fights in civilian clothing. They don't fight in militaristic outfits. So very much like this confuses and blurs the lines a lot. They are using civilians as human shields throughout all of this. They do their fighting out of civilian areas. Like, so for instance, people will constantly talk about the war crimes that Israel is guilty of, and I'm sure they're guilty of some war crimes 100%. But then you also look at it and go, well, guess what? Fighting out of civilian areas is also a war crime. It's a war crime to have military bases in places like hospitals.
Schools,
but again,
yeah.
Time and time again, we're seeing that this is how Hamas operates. So it very much, like, you can lay some of the fault for these casualties at the feet of the Netanyahu government. I think also when you take into factor that Netanyahu himself has been caught on Hotwire before talking about how they were supporting Hamas and propping up Hamas in the early days as a way to ensure that the Palestinians didn't unify, because they saw Hamas and the PLO as they would go to war with one another. So very much the creation of Hamas can be laid at the feet of Israel as well. But when we're giving blame and when we're tossing all of this international shade at Israel, like, you have to keep Hamas in the vision for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's just the same thing that you said. They're using human shields, but they're doing it figuratively as well as literally, right? Because this is what they're doing figuratively by doubling or inflating these numbers. And, you know, I'm going to say it is one of the things that concerns me is that the UN just reduced this number. The UN. So the UNRWA, who is the acting UN agency on the ground there, also has Hamas people, not like hundreds of them working inside their organization, and several of them apparently are top-ranking officials at the UNRWA. So again, are these numbers even accurate? When anybody dies, especially if it's a kid or a woman and they're not involved in a war and they're civilian, terrible. I feel terrible, obviously. But now that this number's been cut in half, rather cavalier too, No real admission of any issue, just kind of like, oh, well, it is what it is. Like, is it even really that high?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, but like, you consider the ramifications of this inaccuracy, and now you just look at all the other people that are still involved, and now this admission of sort of guilt in this particular issue, you kind of go, are we ever going to get the real numbers, and are they even this bad?
No, I don't think we ever will get the real numbers. In my eyes, you can still sit here for sure, and you're justified in saying that all of these things are atrocious, but the whole narrative about genocide and all of that goes out the window when you take an accurate view of what's going on in the Middle East right now. If war has gone on for 6 months and 13,000 civilians out of a population of 2.2 million have died, that's not a genocide. Either Israel doesn't have genocidal intentions, or they are extremely incompetent and unable to act on their genocidal intentions, where I don't think that's the case, because Israel's military is actually extremely capable. So if they were wanting to cause a genocide in Palestine, I think they could have by now if they wanted to.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned this last time, but it's this thing, where you look at what's happening in Israel, and you kind of look at the alliances Israel has, right? You look at how they're allied with the West, but if you look at what's happening in Sudan, in Darfur, like, they've obviously had some massive genocides in 2003 to 2005. I think about 200,000 people died, but since 2023, they've had another one that's been ongoing, and the death toll I know is off base, but the range that they list is between 80,000 to 400,000 people. Most of those are civilians. That is actual genocide. People going into villages and just executing people at scale. No one seems to care. And for me, that's frustrating, because I see a human life as a human life. I don't care what color your skin is. I think it's horrific and atrocious. But these things aren't getting covered, and no one really cares, and no one's protesting about it. And it kind of makes me wonder sometimes about like the sort of the propaganda behind a lot of these things, and what motivates a lot of these protesters and these encampments and stuff like this as well. Because it's not just the value of human life, or else this is what they would be doing for the people in Sudan as well. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to say it's disheartening, because the whole thing is disheartening. I don't want to say one is worse than the other in terms of one lack of action, one action. But it does kind of make you wonder who is pulling the strings and why, because they've mobilized hundreds of thousands of people around the world for Palestine right now, and there's not a peep happening for the people in Sudan.
Yeah. And again, this goes to that same thing that I was talking about with the narratives about the residential schools. This narrative can be used as a way to make the West look uniquely evil, and then therefore that we need to essentially commit cultural suicide out of shame of how terrible we are as a people. And because that doesn't fit the narrative, any of these wars, right? Whether it be the other civil wars happening in the Middle Eastern regions where hundreds of thousands of civilians have died. That's not a helpful narrative, because it's not white people or Eurocentric people killing, indigenous or native peoples to lands or whatever, right?
I think that's a good point you make that I want to highlight, is that when you see these global conflicts happening, whether there's like civil war or they're multiple country like Russia, Ukraine, consider how it is being pitched in the media, consider the volume of coverage, and consider what it does for the narrative. I think that's important, because there's always wars going on, and some, like in Sudan, are far more significant in terms of casualties, but like you said, it doesn't suit the narrative. And I think that's an interesting lens to look at these conflicts through, because they do become a part of your identity, like a lot of these kids for these Palestinian encampments, right? So I think it's an important thing to consider when you're looking at these conflicts that are happening around the world, and just the information you're being fed and why and what that might mean. Because I think a lot of this is like I'm a natural truth seeker. That's just kind of who I am. I feel that it serves me well, and it keeps me sort of unbiased, and I don't really glue myself to my opinions. But because of that, I always kind of want to know why. I want to know what's going on and why people are giving us this information. And I think you made a really good point. Like, why is this getting so much more coverage? Okay, well, what does it do for the narrative? And like you said, you back into it. You sort of reverse engineer, and you're like, it is currently breaking down the West.
Again, I talk about, say, Marxism and communism, and again, it sounds like you're maybe just crying wolf, but like when you look at the numbers, and right, the whole idea with Marxism is to undermine capitalism in the Western world and Western values in general. It is to completely subvert the Western world. But according to a survey in 2006, 25% of sociology professors self-identified as Marxist. There was also another study that found 36% of college students admitted to viewing communism favorably, and a third search result found that in 2021, 51% of young people prefer socialism to capitalism. These are not small numbers. And again, when you look at these pro-Palestine movements, they're blatantly pro-Marxist. And so this is where a lot of it, I think this just gets used as a crux and as an issue that can promote Marxism and socialism.
It's just interesting because a lot of these people just have no life experience. Capitalism's not perfect, but it's unfortunately the best system we have so far. This is how society progresses. Communism doesn't work. Socialism doesn't work. Marxism doesn't. They don't work at scale. They can work in your own home. It's this idea, like Naval Ravikant has this idea, and I'm going to butcher it right now. In your own home, you can be a communist. Everything's fair for everybody's equal. You give everything to everybody, even with your good friends. And then as you continue to work your way out further and further, till you get up to till you get up to the federal government, well, that's where I'm a libertarian. You know what I mean? And you kind of work your way down. So these political systems, if you know, I guess I'll call them political. These political systems have a place in the world. It just depends on how tight the circle is. But when you try to use these things at scale, they are catastrophic. And people to promote these things, they just don't understand history. Or they're arrogant enough. It's a funny human thing. They're arrogant enough to think, well, we're going to do it differently. We're smarter. We're better. We're going to learn from those mistakes. Well, no one else did. And you're a fucking idiot for thinking this in the first place.
All right, so our third story for the day, we've got the wild demands from trans activists for their quote-unquote Rainbow Week of Action. LGBT-related Canadian taxpayer-funded organizations are preparing for their largest rallies yet, expressing concern about what they perceive as increasing levels of hate, which they believe is code for policies they disagree with. They are launching the Rainbow Week of Action next week, distinct from Pride Month and other significant events throughout the year. Organized by the Society of Queer Momentum, these rallies across 12 Canadian cities lead up to May 17th, recognized as the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. As it is called a week of action, there are 5 top demands or claims directed towards elected officials on their website. So, what are those demands, Jonathan?
Oh my God. So the first one is men have no advantage over women in sports. Objectively false. Always affirm a child's self-stated gender identity regardless of their age. Objectively stupid. Allow more biological men into women's prison. Objectively dangerous. Give trans boys faster access to top surgery. Objectively harmful. Free reproductive care. Well, this one is actually understandable because these surgeries are also objectively catastrophic.
I think this just highlights another Orwellian concept that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And this has been my problem with this movement from the start, is that I am somebody who greatly cares about individual rights, because individual rights apply to every single human on this planet. But when you get into the realm of group rights, that inherently is going to create the scenario where some animals are more equal than others.
Yeah, I mean, for me, a lot of this stuff has just gone too far. They've been emboldened to request or demand insane shit. Like, what are we talking about here? When you say there's men have no advantage over women in sports, how come the men keep winning all the women's sports then? Dramatically, like not even close. You know what I mean? It's just how can you make that make sense? Oh, you can't, because it's preposterous. And if I don't go along with it, I'm a bigot. Well, fuck you. That's kind of how I feel about that. And then you get with this affirming a child's self-stated gender. Look, I've been over this before. Children do not have the capacity to make these decisions or understand the ramifications. And we don't allow them to make important decisions until they're 18 about anything else, except for some reason when it comes to choosing your gender and there's subsequent things that follow that, which are the bigger issues. We think that they've got the mental faculties and the emotional intelligence to make that decision. That's preposterous, and that we should leave it up to the parents when we leave everything else up to the parents, but just this one thing. That's categorically insane. And the issue I have with this particularly is when you let a child a girl, a young girl, say she's 7 or 8 years old. I know someone in this particular case that say I'm a boy. Okay, cool. So now everyone around them has to call them a boy, and they have to live this life, right? And they continue on this, but it's how can you even know that at that age? You don't even know enough about yourself. The problem is they're playing along with this game and forcing everybody else to do the same thing, to toe this line. But over time, it becomes more and more of your identity. So when you're 16 or 17 and you don't want to play this game anymore, are you willing to shatter the identity that you've built and you've forced everyone around you to call you a boy? Probably not. Now it's time for top surgery. This is insane where we're taking these kids. Allowing more biological men into women's prison. What? How many more need to get impregnated before we think that's a bad idea? You know, and apparently, and I hate to say this too, but like apparently disease is running rampant through there as well because of this specifically. And then when it comes to all these surgeries, like, look, you want to do what you want to do? Go ahead and do it. I don't care. I should, as a taxpayer, should have nothing to do with covering any of those fees whatsoever. That is purely optional. And to me, here's the other problem, and you know, people might want to try to deny this or whatever because it saved lives. It makes lives a lot worse. Suicide rates are actually higher post-surgery. They don't talk about anybody detransitioning, which is quite often horrific. Here's the other thing. When you do these things to your body, that's not what it's used to doing. So if you give a man a vagina, what you have is an open wound. And what you have is your body constantly trying to heal it all the time. So you're hopped up on drugs always to try to keep your body leveled out. Your immune system's totally trash. So the rest of your life, you're now going to suffer and struggle with this because they saved your life. Look, like you said, do whatever you want to do. But stop painting this narrative as some life-saving, gender-affirming care. And just call it what it is. Because for the most part, it's horrific. And when you're doing it to children, it's completely unacceptable. But if you're 18 and want to do it, go ahead. Just use your own money.
A fun game to play here with this movement would be go ask them, what's the line? What's your end point in this movement? Where do you sit there and go, okay, we are safe and we feel good as a community? What you'll find is that there is no end point. It's never ending. It's that same idea that, you know, Peterson said in regards to tyranny, where take an inch, take an inch, take an inch, take an inch. You say, hey, you've gone too far. They slow down, they sit back until you've now adapted to this new baseline, and then take an inch, take an inch, take an inch until you say, nope, stop, and then adapt to that baseline. And they keep going and keep going and keep going. I don't see an end to this until everybody just sits here and says, look, screw this. We're not playing this game anymore. And you know what? Even going back to my original point about individual rights versus group rights, you cannot tell me that you care about minorities unless you care about individual rights, which this is a direct infringement on, right? Even my speech ability to say that I disagree with this, that is in my individual rights to do so. You cannot say to me that you care about minorities if you do not care about individual rights, because the individual is the greatest minority that has ever existed.
To wrap it up, I agree with you. I think that society, and I think you and I have gotten to this point, look, I'm not phobic against anything. I don't care what anybody wants to be. I do not give a shit. Go live your life. I'm happy for you, genuinely. But when it comes to all this other stuff, when you're infringing on everyone else's rights and you're making society sort of bend to the will of a very small minority in ways that are actually preposterous, don't really make sense. They're completely illogical. It's not a good way to raise kids in this environment where we play this stupid game at scale. People are going to start pushing back, like you and I. We've just had enough, you know, especially when it comes to the kids. I've had enough. And I think society just needs to get to the same point. And, you know, what's interesting is the more preposterous this group becomes with these things, the more likely it is that people are going to say, no, you know what? I'm going to draw my line in the sand now, just like you and I have.
Yeah. All right, our next story for the day, we've got CSIS warning that China is exploiting renewable energy to gain leverage over Canada. In a recent briefing, Canada's intelligence agency, CSIS, raised concerns about China's strategic exploitation of the renewable energy sector. The report reveals China's intent to leverage its control over critical minerals essential for battery and computer chip production, posing significant challenges to Canadian and allied interests. China adopts a dual approach to energy, heavily reliant on fossil fuels while also exploiting renewables for strategic purposes. Despite leading in renewable energy, China often produces renewables using polluting energy sources and exports them to foreign markets. Moreover, China's dominance in supply chains raises concerns about other nations' dependence, including Canada. For Canada and Canadians, These developments have profound implications. China's attempts to control supply chains and critical minerals could compromise Canada's economic sovereignty and energy transition efforts. So, is this another example of why citizens in the West should be skeptical of the green energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, we're completely vulnerable, right? It's super expensive energy. We can't produce enough of it. And now we're going to be competing with China because they're going to be leveraging the resources to access it so that it costs us even more. Of course, this is insane. So here's my thought. Canada is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world. We have vast resources of minerals. Our forests are some of the largest in the world, I think second or third, which, fun fact, we don't even need 10% of them to be carbon neutral. So here's a big fuck you to any carbon tax arguments. Canada also has an abundance of freshwater resources and exceptional farmland. We also maintain the world's third largest proven oil reserves. And according to the Canadian Gas Association, we have the most natural gas in the world with 1,368 trillion cubic feet of natural gas resources. Not to mention, Canada is the second largest country in the world with one of the lowest population densities in the world at just 4.35 people per square kilometer. So my point is, if Canada had competent leadership and would properly leverage its resources, we could sustain ourselves with little to no problem. We would be a leading energy supplier to the world, have an incredibly strong economy, and give little to no consideration to what China tries to do to our economy. We could just basically push them out.
And it's a complete denial of the fact that much of the renewable energy projects, like, for instance, whether it be solar stuff coming out of China, is completely reliant on slave labor in the Xinjiang region with Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. They found that roughly 40% of the solar panels in the UK are directly linked to production in that region with Uyghur Muslims. And so, you know, we're sitting here and we're talking about equity in the Western world and being fair to all of these people, but then completely turn a blind eye in this realm. And you know what? Even if, like, I could actually respect the fact if people were sitting there and saying, I'm not saying I agree with this, but I would at least respect the honesty if somebody was to sit there and say, you know what, climate change is such an existential threat, it's such a threat to humanity that I am willing to have that if slave labor is needed to make sure that humanity doesn't go extinct, then I'm okay with that. That you're at least dealing with the reality of the picture. But when you just completely change it and act like as if there's zero consequences to the renewable energy production, then I mean, we're living in fantasy land. How am I supposed to debate somebody when it comes to when they're completely delusional about the realities of these technologies? And even Michael Schellenberger has pointed out too, say not even from the unethical labor front, but he once said, quote, "People like the idea of solar farms in the abstract, but hundreds of communities around the world are currently fighting them because they require 300 to 600 times more land than other energy sources, produce 300 times more toxic waste, and devastated critical wildlife habitats." And then, okay, forget about the solar panels for a second. These wind turbines end up mostly in landfills. And so again, when your whole thing is we need to save the environment, but then these are devastating critical wildlife as well as ending up in landfills, I'm sorry, your entire argument goes out the window.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's like we have this nasty habit of brushing everything under the rug like nothing's there. We're offshoring slave labor. We're offshoring our environmental impact. We're offshoring sort of our carbon footprint. We're offshoring all of this stuff to try to pretend that we're virtuous. But again, I think it all comes down to like political posturing. I think that's what this is all about. Because even if you pay attention in this whole like only EVs by 2035, that's nothing but political nonsense. It's not going to happen. They're not even. Did you see the other day there was massive protests at the Gigafactory, the Tesla Gigafactory in Germany, but they're climate activists.
Yeah.
And they're demanding that he stop his expansion of his climate-friendly cars. Well, maybe they're not that climate-friendly after all. I mean, they're zealots, you know what I mean? It's just kind of one of those funny things. It's like, it's that Ouroboros thing. The snake's eating its own tail. It's just happening in other countries, you know?
So you pointed out how these climate zealots were protesting at the most quote-unquote environmentally friendly option for vehicles, right? Tesla. Again, when you stop thinking that these people want sustainable growth, like what they say, and you start realizing that what they really want is a concept called degrowth, which is that humans have grown at a rate that the environment in the world can't keep up with, and therefore we need to fundamentally change the way that we live and actually degrow both of our population and our civilizations. Then all of their actions become much more understandable within that frame. Doesn't mean I condone it by any means. I actually wholeheartedly disagree with them. But what's the number one thing that has given the greatest rise to population growth?
Cheap energy. Yeah.
Because cheap energy keeps the lights on. It allows you to upgrade your agricultural production. All of this, everything is on the backbone of fossil fuels for our civilization. And so in that regard, they are right, but they don't have any, I don't think they actually have any goal of creating a better and more environmentally friendly world other than doing that through degrowth.
Right. That makes sense. No, that makes sense. I mean, it's pretty dark, and I don't believe anybody should really be dictating how the world operates. But yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, because none of this stuff really points to the solution they're all making us look at. You know what I mean? So no, I totally agree. I think that's a good perspective.
Next story of the day, we've got Bank of Canada warning mortgage payment renewals will skyrocket over 60% by 2026. The Bank of Canada's 2024 Financial Stability Report warns of impending price hikes for mortgage renewals, particularly affecting those who took out mortgages in 2021 and early 2022. The hardest hit are homeowners who borrowed when interest rates were low, facing an increased debt service ratio to rising rates. By 2026, Canadians renewing variable rate mortgages with fixed payments will experience the most substantial increase of 61.85%. Overall, mortgage payments are projected to rise by 31.88% across all mortgage types by 2026. Increasing interest rates pose challenges such as variable rate holders paying mostly interest and delaying principal payments. This situation, combined with higher interest rates upon renewal, could sharply raise housing costs. So will Canadian homeowners be able to stay financially upright during these shaky times?
I think no matter how you skin this situation, we have a big problem coming. So housing prices are poised to increase by 4.9% this year, and according to the CMHC, as much as 20% by 2026. So as a result, no matter what, interest rates are going to stay higher for longer, because that's the mechanism they use to try to quell housing prices. So you're seeing right now today that mortgages will increase by as much as 60%. That's going to be higher. The problem with this is it's going to further price Canadians out of the market, and many immigrants as well. They're going to have no option here. It will also cause more insolvencies. However, demand is still so high that I expect, this is my assumption, that foreclosures are unlikely to correct the market. And the cherry on top is that this will drive rent prices even higher, which rose by nearly 10% just last month. I mean, if you add the fact that nearly 50% of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck right now, the average family of four can barely break even given the average cost of living, and that doesn't include the cost of servicing debt, and the fact that Canadians have the highest household debt to GDP ratio in the G7, well, you have a very, very vulnerable society. It's almost as if Trudeau is priming us to roll out his universal basic income, which I read something about on the weekend, which started populating in the news again.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Dude, I saw the writing on the wall with this a while back. Whenever that first initial housing boom was happening and buyers just going crazy and the market was going crazy early on in the pandemic and people were paying 10, 20, 30% over asking, I was just like, there's no way that this ends well, knowing that, first of all, our inflation was a ticking time bomb with how much money we were printing and sending out through these government programs. I was like, okay, this is going to get real bad. The cost of living is going to get bad. Interest rates will definitely go up, their mortgage rates. And then you already saw people, like, I couldn't understand it. Like, give me one other thing on in the world that you would willingly go, this is how much it's worth, and then now pay me 30% higher for it. I'm not paying 30% over what something's worth. How does that make sense? But all of a sudden, when it came to housing, people were like, this makes sense for me.
It was, you know what it actually reminded me of? When I was a kid, every year there was a toy that at Christmas that everybody wanted so much. So if you didn't get it in enough time, you ended up paying 2, 3, 4, 10 times the price. I think it was Furbies when I was a kid. That was the hot one. People were paying 10x the price right near Christmas, right? Because they couldn't get their hands on these things. Same as the housing problem. But again, a lot of the supply and demand issues sort of arbitrarily created. So were the massive increase in housing prices. This is all on Trudeau. He printed $400 billion. It went in through the process of quantitative easing. The money was loaned out to people that had good credit, and then the corporate ownership of homes fucking quadrupled over the pandemic in terms of the volume that they pick up in that period. It quadrupled. This is 100% on Trudeau. He created this fucking mess. Every bit of it is on this guy. And people want to go, well, no, everyone else is suffering. No, you did not need to do that. None of this was necessary. You could have let us stay open in some capacity. So him printing all this money and making this mess, and now this whole issue with the housing crisis. And the thing is, housing is what's keeping inflation high, but housing being high is what's keeping interest rates high and driving immigration in at record numbers. It's what's going to keep all of these things high on an ongoing basis. I mean, just this last month, we added 90,000 new jobs to the market, except unemployment stayed the exact same at 6.1% because we allowed so many new people in the country. What the fuck are we doing? The challenge I have here is people don't give Trudeau enough shit for what he's doing. The guy is the CEO of a business. Canada is a corporation, and this guy's running it into the fucking ground with our money.
People are about to see it for real, man. Even outside of the housing market, you know, I've got some people that own a business like that are close to me, and they deal with heavy equipment and stuff like that. And they were even saying, man, it's crazy that now we're having troubles moving any ATV or any recreational vehicles and this and that. And I'm like, when for the entire pandemic, we were 6-month wait list for all of these products. And I just said, like, dude, do you realize like how bad the economy is right now? Of course nobody is buying luxury items, and it's only going to get worse over the next couple of years. This is not just a transitionary period like the Yeller down in the States would like to call it. This is like once in a century type of economic issues.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. I think this is going to get a lot worse before it gets any better. And I think a lot of people right now are going, well, they're going to lower interest rates next month or the month after. Everything's going to be fine. No, it's not. We are just, guys, this is just sinking in. This is going to be a decade of economic turmoil. And there'll be ups and downs, and there'll be opportunities. It's not like everything's going to suck and everything's going to be on fire. But this is the way things are going to be for a while, because so much has to change to find balance here. The number one thing that I like to look at, my proxy, is what is the cost of living? And I like to use the average family of four. That's the easiest thing to do. And what is the average income for a family of four? Those numbers can't be the same. It's such a horrific issue when those numbers are the same. You can't, and us having the worst debt to GDP ratio, like people don't pay enough attention to that. But what it means is Canadians have no safety net. So if shit hits the fan, we can't leverage any more debt. We don't have any more room. So when you start losing all these things, yeah, like, I think that we will find a way to hang on, and I think we'll drag this out, though, for quite some time. I don't think we're going to see a massive volume of bankruptcies like they saw in 2008, because I think this is going to be a slower death. You know, I think people are going to hang on and continue to leverage debt and continue to try to sneak by, and I think you may have as many people go bankrupt, but I think it'll be over a longer period of time. It may even be more just over a longer period of time. It's sort of that death by 1,000 cuts versus the one nuclear bomb, which happened in 2008, right? And the reason I say that happened is, usually if the economy falls apart, you can see the hole in the boat, right? And you say, okay, well, that's where the leak's coming from. Now I understand. But Trudeau and these Western governments, they took a shotgun and blew out the bottom of the hull of the boat. So this hole everything's leaking. So it's you can't really identify exactly what's going on. And that's why it's going to take so much longer to fix as well.
If we continue on with these policies, the monetary policies, we add guaranteed livable basic income on top of that, plus we don't slow down immigration at all, it's like inevitable that hyperinflation will occur.
Well, what's going to happen actually? So rather than it going to an issue of hyperinflation, he's going to continue printing money, right? And then he's going to continue giving it away. It's going to be through this universal basic income thing, right? So, but what'll happen is we'll just continue amassing national debt. You see, they just bumped it again now. They want to have it to 2.1 trillion. You know what I mean? Before Trudeau, it was not even a trillion. So they want to continue moving that needle. It's the same thing they're doing in the States. Look how much money they owe, but their inflation and interest rates, or their interest rates are about the same, but their inflation's better than ours, right? And their economy's growing. There are mechanisms that the government can pull. When they start just printing money, they can stave off that hyperinflation.
That is the cause of hyperinflation.
But the thing is, when they continue, it's their own debt though, right? Because they can just continue to track debt. So if use the US as an example, they're $34 trillion in debt, right? It's basically a made up number. We're about 1.6 trillion dollars in debt, right? But look at how their economy is currently operating. right? They're not suffering from hyperinflation. It's this basically this safety net that governments can create, that it does create a problem for you down the road, but it's like you can blow hot air into that balloon and push that problem off. So that's very likely what's going to happen. That's why I don't think you're going to see that big blow up.
I completely disagree, because you do stave that off, you do push it back, but that just means that the blow up's going to be bigger. There's zero chance of doubling your money supply essentially and your national debt and not ending up in hyperinflation.
I don't disagree with you in the fact that it's going to create a much bigger problem, but it will buy them a lot of time. If national debt was definitely going to cause hyperinflation, then why wouldn't the United States already be suffering from hyperinflation? And your point's going to be, well, they're still amassing debt, right? So here's my point is this. We don't know where the ceiling is because they just keep lifting it. So what I'm saying is, you're not wrong. Eventually you have to pay the piper, but what if you never have to pay the piper? And that's what's happening in the States. They just keep raising the ceiling and their economy continues to move forward. And what I'm saying is, Canada's going to move into that same situation. We're going to continue printing money and continue amassing national debt, but if we don't ever have to pay that piper, you're not going to feel it. Eventually, I'm sure you will. Eventually, all of this shit is going to come crashing down. But when? It might not even be in our lifetime, in that sense of hyperinflation and the economy being completely destroyed. I don't know.
Here's the analogy I would use is, envision it like a time bomb, and that the clock is racing down, but every time you print more money, you're essentially adding, say, a minute to the timer, and you can do that and you can keep hitting that, but every time you hit that, you also have to add, say, more explosives to the bomb. So therefore, when it does finally run out, the explosion is going to be bigger. And I think we've talked about this before as well, is what I think very much the strategy there could be is making sure that bomb waits long enough and then will explode large enough that it happens in the conservatives' hands and makes them look terrible.
I think it's going to be bumped down the road way further, way further. So the way you look at these things are, I believe that politicians and governments know that national debt has become a necessary evil to operate. And I think that they all know the same thing.
I don't think that's true at all.
Well,
look at what's happening in Argentina.
No. I again, it's blowing up, but they're a lot more volatile. The U.S. currency, what's interesting about them is they're the reserve currency in the world still, right? That may be changing over time with this new BRICS alliance, but right now they are. So they're the most significant currency globally. So they have there's like external stability that happens because of that, right? Canada doesn't get to benefit from the same thing for sure. So they may be a little more vulnerable, but with how these countries, they continue to amass debt. And if you look at it, the States is not trying to reduce it. It's just growing rapidly right now, just going up. So here's the thing. You're going, well, it's going to fall on the conservatives. But if you can keep printing money and you can keep increasing your national debt, do you want to take the fall or do you want to push it off to the next government? Because I bet you're not going to want to take the fall. So you're going to continue to push it off. That's exactly what I imagine they're going to continue to do here. The conservatives might do a good job to try to balance things out, but mark my words, the national debt is definitely going up when the conservatives are in power, for sure.
We'll see if that ends up happening. Then, I mean, Poilievre's going to get booted pretty quickly because he won't be doing what the people want him to.
Do you think the people care about national debt? What do you think? What do you think the people? What do you think
the people voting for Poilievre do?
You think they know enough about what he's going to do to reduce national debt? What do you think that looks like?
That's exactly what he's promising.
What's his
he's
plan?
Reducing. Spend a dollar, save a dollar is his main plan for government spending. If you want at all to create a new area for government spending, then that means you have to reduce spending somewhere else.
A new area.
That means that you have to reduce spending somewhere else.
But that's a new area. So people are just going to stop expanding. Already we're way out of control. The size of if he cuts our government in half, we're still going to be losing money every year. We are so far out of control. All these social programs, there's no way this guy can get the spending under control to put us at a deficit. There's no way. There's no way.
Yeah, we'll see. Time will tell. All right, so our sixth story for the day taps into the emotion that you were just feeling there with me. The rage index reaches all-time high as Canadians are angry with the government, economy, and policies. This index measures Canadians' feelings of pleasure or displeasure about the federal and provincial governments, the national economy, personal finance situations, changes in Canada, and recent news stories. On average, 58% of Canadians expressed annoyance annoyance or anger across these 6 topics, marking a 5% increase since January. Specifically, the number of Canadians feeling very angry about these topics rose by 4% to 21%. The highest levels of annoyance or anger were directed at the Canadian economy, followed closely by the latest news stories, with 67 and 63% expressing such sentiments respectively. So are Canadians justified in feeling angry about the current state of affairs in the country?
I'm definitely one of the 21%. Yeah, I mean, look, it's a dumpster fire. What part of the government, what part of the government or what part of the country is operating well right now? I'll wait.
Zero.
That's what I mean. There's a lot of good reason for people to be upset with the way things are today. And unfortunately, we're part of the problem with the news stories probably, so I'm sorry about that. But like, I think knowledge is power. I think it's better to understand what's going on, even if it's upsetting. I do think it gives you more power and more control over your life, and you don't need to get lost in the weeds like we do sometimes. But I do think it's important to know what's going on, because if you just keep the wool over your eyes all the time, people like Trudeau and Freeland and other governments around the world that are doing the same things, they continue to flourish. You need to pay attention so you can push back. I think that's key. But yeah, I mean, you and I just went on a long tirade about the economy. It's a total disaster right now. There's no opportunity here, right? So, I mean, I can understand why everybody's completely pissed off. I feel it myself, I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, you and I have talked about this too. I don't think Canada's going to be my home for very long, because there is no opportunity really for me here anymore. And there's this other thing that happened too through the pandemic, and my kind of relationship with the government, because they fucked me so hard. I actually have a little bit of resentment towards it, and in the sense of like, I don't want to build another business here and contribute any more to this because of what they've done to me and what they've done to this country and how they continue to frivolously spend our money. So yeah, like for me, like I'm actually past the rage stage and I'm in the get the fuck out stage.
Yeah, I'm of the mind where it's justified for people to feel that way, but it's not useful. So I think by all means, you should at all times try to cultivate an inner sense of peace and definitely just whoosha that stuff off. Because, I've said before, anger is the easiest emotion to manipulate. And that goes on both sides, whether you're on the left-wing side and you're extremely angry about the current state of cultural affairs and you think white supremacy and racism is the most urgent issue facing North America and Europe, or whether you're on the right side of the aisle and you feel like the economy and our issues on that front are the most urgent issue, then it's just not helpful in either scenario to be filled with rage, because then it just means you're not going to make level-headed decisions. It's impossible to in a state of rage. But also there's 3 different stages. You were talking about reaching that resentful stage. It's like there's or us playing into the aspect of, say, bad news stories leading to rage. I completely agree, and I struggle sometimes being like, I know I can handle this information without getting into a rage on a day-to-day basis, but like, am I having a negative impact by creating that anger in other people, maybe for not being able to look at these things just kind of more level-headedness? But there's 3 different stages, and I think ignorance is the worst. Ignorance is by far the worst possible stage to be in. The stage after ignorance is cynicism, which is that kind of resentful, like very despair, that hatred of what's going on, and that's that rage. But then there is a point above that as well where you can reach, which I don't think is optimism. I think optimism is stupid. But
I'm inherently optimistic.
But I think you can be hopeful. I think you can be hopeful.
What's the difference, asshole?
Optimism is thinking that things will go right. Hopeful is knowing that if you take the right actions, things can go right. It's not a thinking that just 100%. Optimism is like, oh, things will get better, don't you worry. No, hopeful is things are absolutely terrible right now, but if we do X, Y, Z and we keep our head on our shoulders, we can have a better future.
So let me explain to you why you should be optimistic, people. If you can solve all of your problems, you can be eternally optimistic, because no matter what, you are going to get to a solution. You have to be at peace with what those might be sometimes, but I actually live, like I'm a very optimistic person because I can actually fix all of my problems. You know what I mean? I live in that world, and even though I haven't fixed them all today, I know that I'm working towards them. So anyway.
if you're going to fix problems, it means you have to be willing to admit those problems exist in the first place, and having a realistic view on them. And I think that goes to what you were saying about definitely still, people maybe don't need to get in the weeds as much as you and I do on a daily basis, but you have to, if we're going to change the trajectory of this country, we do have to take a realistic view of just how bad it is in the moment.
Yeah, and I to your point, and kind of to your sort of structure and how you view people's different stages of this, it's important for people to be upset and pissed off before they can actually find the solution. And that's why I actually see this as a positive, eternally optimistic, is because people are aware. You can't be upset if you don't know what's going on, and people are pissed off because they're actually paying attention now, which is good, because when enough people get mad, they will actually do something about it. It's that, I forget the name of it, you're going to know, it's this theory about if things are bad, you'll deal with it. But when they're bad,
beta region paradox.
The beta region paradox. When things are bad, you'll deal with it. But when they're bad enough, you'll do something. And I think we're getting to this point where the rage index, it's all-time high, it's bad enough.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think definitely ignorance is the worst possible stage that we can ever be in. All right, anything else you wanted to add today, brother?
That's everything.
All right, don't forget to head over to our website, blendrnews.com, BLENDR news.com, to sign up for our newsletter, which goes out 6 days a week, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.